Bruchim Aboyim B'Shem Irgin Shir Torah Moses Boston. I'd like to welcome everyone to tonight's shir. Active Big Ashikach to our Blazer Steinmetz of Weiss Paints for sponsoring tonight's shir. We'd also like to Big Ashikach to the other sponsor of tonight's shir is a schus the Nishmas from Michal Yitzchak Ben Yaakov Yosef Zchon Avrocha Sauerhof. By said one share remaining, Chaperein the schus of Attired. The Rabbim, one share remaining for the summer night shirim, but of course Irgun Shir Torah continues shirim throughout the year. Call Irgun Shir Torah 718-851-8651. Email tapecenter@yeshivanet.com for the great schus of sponsoring a share over here or throughout the year, Sunday morning or many other shirim. Tonight we have a special opportunity to have with us International Kashrus advisor Rabbi Zalmen Krems, discuss Kosher Specialties, wine, cheese, and meat. We also have Rabbi Zalmen board noted asking in the field of Kashrus to ask the Shabbos. There'll be a Shabbos Tshuva format. So we'll cover the corner by Krems for tonight's shir.
Good evening. It's a pleasure to be here and talk a little bit about Kashrus. Usually Kashrus is something people don't like talking about that much. It relates to, it's too close to home, as we say. So first of all, we're going to make a disclaimer before we start. A lot of, in legalese, they always write, because of whatever the fads in the world is in the 21st century, that every language is inclusive of male, female, whatever. So everything's inclusive of all different kashrus agencies. We're not out to get anybody, and we're not going to be speaking about one kashrus agency in particular. They're general topics that relate to kashrus. So it's just important to note, if I do, as a slip of tongue, mention a kashrus agency's name, I'm not calling anybody out. I will try not to. But if such a thing does happen, it should be noted that it is generally applies across the board. There was recently a story that was circulated in Eretz Yisrael from Rabbi Zalmen Krems, Yashiv's son-in-law, that there was a family that made an event somewhere, and they brought in a private mashgiach. And this private mashgiach was being paid by the family to make sure that everything was kosher. And this mashgiach noted that there was some problem with the meat that was being used. He wasn't so sure it was so safe to eat. Not kashrus necessarily. The food was perfectly kosher, but it was off a little bit. So he mentioned something to the chef, and the chef threw him off. And the chef says, it's none of your business. You mind your own business. You're being paid for kashrus, you take care of kashrus. Keep your nose out of the food preparation side of things. The event went on, and lo and behold, the next day, everybody had food poisoning. So they came to ask the Shiloh, did they have to pay this mashgiach or not? They wanted to withhold. The chef didn't get paid. That wasn't happening, right? But did they have to pay the mashgiach or not? So the mashgiach said, what do you mean? You hired me for food. I mentioned this to the chef. The chef threw me off. The chef told me, get lost, right? None of your business. What do you want from me? So interestingly enough, Rabbi Zalmen, again, this is printed in some one of his things that came out recently, not one of the Svarim, not Oz Nadabru, but one of these Shabbos Alonim, I don't know what they call it here in this country, newsletters. He said, no, they can dock his pay because he was negligent. He should have notified them that there's something wrong. It's not really what you hired him for. So, of course, the kashrus world, they hear this, and everybody's like, this is, if we start, how many mashgiachim are going to get fired? Nothing is going to last. There won't be anything left. We won't be able to eat anything. So the reason I'm telling this story is just to be able to understand the scope of how far kashrus goes. Kashrus doesn't just start and end with a basic siman and shulchan aruch and just what some of us might think is common sense. It goes beyond that. There are some kashrus agencies in the world that have attempted to partner up with other third-party auditing companies, whether it's for vegan certification, organic certification, so on and so forth. Some of them had realized after going in these type of endeavors that it's not so easy to do, because the second you're privy to the information, and Kashrus agencies are involved on a much deeper and broader scope than most of these third-party auditors ever are. At best, they come once a year, sometimes every 2 or 3 years, if they're doing a physical audit. Where hashgachas are doing, if it's a restaurant, obviously there's hashgacha tmidis, but we're talking about in a there's constant supervision. But when you're talking about in a factory, most places there's no mashgiach, there's no kosher supervisor on site at all times, but you're there on quite a regular basis. When you're involved on such a level, you will always find things that not every T is crossed and not every I is dotted. So how do you what? So the norm in the United States for a regular kashrus setup is usually once a month. That's sort of the default in the normal non-hamish hashgachas. But it obviously depends on the product. Some products might have hashgacha tmidis, they might have full-time supervision even with any regular, normal international or national agency or local VAD, and some products might only get a visit once a year. Again, it all depends on what the exact product is. Again, back to where we're holding. That was to understand the breadth and scope. I heard a Maisa, I live now in Attired, but before that, for 6 years, I ran the KVH, the Vodka of Boston, and when I moved there, the Boston Rebbe, not initial, but the Boston Rebbe of Boston, Massachusetts, asked me to go speak with his Mechutton's Shver, Rabbi Zalmen Krems Spitzer in Bar Park. He was nifter a few years ago. So one of the things that he told me is that when he was a dayan in the Wiener Kila, they asked him, he said, they certified a bakery. You have to eat bread, so they certified a bakery. You have to make wine for Kiddush, right? So fine, we certify wine. I guess there was probably some small shechita as well that they certified. They came and asked him to certify a restaurant. He said, Adkan. That's as far as it's going. It's too much to take responsibility for. He couldn't fathom how to deal with something that it's just not a necessity. Again, this is 50, 60 years ago. Tell people it's not a necessity today. Maybe, I don't know if people would agree with that statement. But again, understanding the scope of what kashrus is and what's involved, you have a serious chashav arav that when you bring up the idea of certifying something as dynamic as a restaurant, every minute things are changing. That's something that if it's not absolutely necessary, he felt that it's something that's hard to do. And there's the famous tshuva from the Satmar Rav. Rabbi Elish's yahrzeit was today. So we'd be remiss not to mention that if I believe the Nirbater and the Volova Rav's father in Hungary still wrote a question to the Satmar Rav asking him about a product that he certified, and something wasn't 100% in the best level of way he wanted it to be. And so he asked him if he has to make a disclaimer on the hashgacha. So he's going to write on the package, kosher hashgachas, the Nirbater Rav. But does he have to write a disclaimer that it's missing something? And Rabbi Elish responded it's a long tshuva, I don't remember exactly the exact format, but he responded something along the lines of, no, of course you don't have to. Anybody that's buying a manufactured product knows that it's not mahadran, mina mahadran. It's just not possible to get every single thing. Baruch Hashem, things have moved since that point to a level where there are a lot of products on the market that really are 100% l'mahadran. But again, understanding that scope of the complexity of kashrus, and it's not always as simple as it looks. One thing that's important to note, anytime we're talking about hashgacha, many people, there's a book that was published a few years ago, somebody put it, I forgot the name, what it's called, about an academic made a study on how the Jewish community has self-regulated. With kashrus agencies, we've created our own self-regulation system to supervise these factories. It's not mandated by any government, it's not mandated by any entity, but it became a successful regulatory institution, or institutions. And so some people think this is a modern invention. Hashgacha is created in the 21st century, which to a certain degree is true. However, if we look back, most people associate modern day kashrus with a takana of vadal artzos. There was a Jewish self-governance in Europe that for a few hundred years controlled Jewish life. One of the takanas that it instituted, that the Achronim, the later commentaries mention, is that they instituted a rule that nobody should buy product. It's not so clear. There's a few different sources on exactly what the takana was, but you should not buy at least more kasher sensitive items like meat, wine, cheese that are not certified by some rabbi. Otherwise, you're not allowed to buy it. It's a takana vadal. So most people associate kashrus as we know it today with that edict. However, if we go back in history, Chazal, we find already that this is not a new concept. There's a whole sif in Shulchan Aruch of Metar Nishal Nachri. A guy wants to make wine and sell it to the Jewish community, and obviously, if somebody that worships idols or is not Shem Shabbos, then it can create problems with winemaking. So you have to do it in a kosher way that it's controlled by people that have ne'emonos. So there's a siman in Shulchan Aruch about that, which goes back to the Gemara, of course. There's even a more interesting source, which I believe is Yerushalmi, the whole concept of Demai, Trumas and Maisus, that if you're not sure if Trumas and Maisus were taken, there was a takana from Rabbi Yochanan Kohen Gadol to that if there's a product that you don't know for sure, or you're buying produce from an Amaretz, then you have to take Trumas and Maisus misafik because of Demai. So the Mishnah there says that b'yamav, you don't have to ein sheyalam ala Demai. You don't have to take Trumas and Maisus from Demai. So the Yerushalmi says why? Because shehemid zugos, he appointed zugos, pairs of Talmidei Chachamim that went around. Again, if this is all Eretz Yisrael or just in Yerushalayim, it doesn't really say that clearly, but at least in Yerushalayim, I would assume he had Talmidei Chachamim that went around and made sure that every stall that was selling produce in the shuk, not like today where things are a little bit hefker, even if there is a certificate, it's not always the way it should be, but anything that was sold then, you did not have to be shayal al admai, you did not have to take Trumas and Maisus from that, and everything was good. So we see that this concept of setting up some kind of hashgacha system to make sure that what Klal Yisrael is eating is kosher in the best way possible goes back literally from the time the Chazal made a takana on something being aser. Demai midaraisa is mutter, right? Called the parish meruba parish, but they made a takana that not to. From that point on, they put a system in place to make sure that things happened, and so on throughout history. When we're talking about hashgachas, you have to divide them sort of into two large groups. There are, like I said before, vad takanas dalad artzis. It just says as long as there was a hashgacha from some rav, from some av beis din in some place. It could be his own personal endeavor, or you could have a kashrus system that is a community institution. It's a kehila geschäft. It belongs to the community. Nobody is making a personal buck on the business. You can have private rabbanim that aren't making money either, but it's their own personal name that's involved, as opposed to when something is done as a community. Now there are pluses and minuses to both of these. If you have a community organization, this is more common with smaller communities, but it happens on every level, up to the biggest kashrus agencies. If something is a community institution, then there's communal pressures. There are people involved in the community. Either they have certain needs that have to be met, or players that have their own reasons why they want something to be done. So there's been stories where the kashrus professionals, the rabbis involved, don't want to give hashgacha, but the balabatim, so to speak, they push that there should be hashgacha be given. Why? Because Yankel's our friend, and even though that everything's not perfect, but Yankel's our friend. We have to make sure it happens. But when you have a private hashgacha, to a certain degree, you're less prone to that pressure because you don't know anybody anything. It's my own personal hashgacha. So who's going to tell me yes or no? The flip side, if a person is doing something on his own behalf, especially if there's money involved, but even without money, covet is also worth a lot. A lot of people are swayed by covet. So therefore, there's always going to be that concern that a person might end up making the wrong decisions because of that. So these are two important pieces of information to weigh whenever you're looking at hashgacha. Who's standing behind this hashgacha? Is it a community or is it a private person? A rav, chashuv a rav, but a private individual. So just to recap a little bit before we get on to the three main points that are on the topic. Recap where we are a little bit. The scope of kashrus is very, very broad. It does not limit itself just to kashrus itself. There are a lot of interpersonal involvements, whether it's things that can get spoiled and be served, or dealing with people that are there in the kitchen or in the factories. How far do you want to take the hashgachas? Do every single product in the world has to be certified? Somebody comes up with some new crazy idea of doing something. We have to certify it? Or are we limiting that to things that people need? And then who decides what people need, obviously, is the question. Right? And then understanding what the format of the hashgacha is. It is a person's private hashgacha. Is it a communal hashgacha? That's something that's very important to understand. So the three topics that we put on the agenda for tonight, which we're going to talk about briefly, we're not going to spend here the whole night. Meat, cheese, and wine. Why were these three things chosen? Well, anytime we're sort of in Ben Azmanim, we're in the summer period, people travel more, they go out of their element. When people are at home, most people at least have the regular items that they buy. They have the regular shopping list. Today they have apps, people order things online, or you go into supermarkets and they have, I haven't seen it actually over here, but actually not in the Hamish market over here, but in Eretz Yisrael you walk into some of the grocery stores, you can get these handheld devices and you scan the things. Well, it actually keeps a memory of what you actually bought last time and asks you, do you want to rebuy these things? Right? And easily add it to your cart. Right? They know everything. So when people are at home and they have the regular items that they buy, it's very easy to set a certain kashrus standard, either a specific hashgacha, specific brands, specific items that either you have a first-hand information, you verified, for whatever reason it is, you say, these are products that I feel are at a kashrus standard that I want. Or there are some people that will buy any product with whatever hashgachas they rely on. I have my 10, 15, 20, 100, 1,000, whatever number of hashgachas you want to rely on, that your Rav tells you should rely on. And I just buy it. I don't care what stands behind it. The difference between those two different dynamics, we'll discuss briefly when we get to the next 3 points. But when somebody's at home, it's very easy to do that. The second somebody starts traveling and they go outside of their element, it might be even just across the Hudson River. Right? It might not be a very far trip. And all of a sudden, the same things that they're used to buying aren't available. Something's different. I'm always used to buying my Hamish item, and all of a sudden, the Hamish thing doesn't exist. When I was in Boston, I'll preface this first with one other point. Before I was in Boston, I lived in Oregon. I worked for the Chaf K mainly at that point, and they sent out a survey to all of their staff. And I don't remember all the questions, but 2 questions I remember. One of them was, if you go into the supermarket and you buy a piece of mezainis, you buy a Danish cupcake, turnover croissant, do you assume it's dairy or do you assume it's parv? Do you assume it's pas Yisrael or do you assume it's pas palter? Do you assume, right? What's your assumption? And it came out that anybody, from the results, if I remember correctly, it came out anybody that was makbid on Chalav Yisrael, they never heard of dairy croissants. Dairy, because it just doesn't exist in a Chalav Yisrael variety. So if you're buying things in a Hamish store, it almost doesn't exist. You go to Eretz Yisrael, it actually does exist, which makes things very complicated. But that people are used to what they're used to. If you live in Brooklyn, you live in Flatbush, you live in Borough Park, you're not going to find these things unless you walk in the ShopRite or one of the non-Jewish chains. So when people have their area where they're used to buying the regular things, they know a certain level. So somebody called up, it was during Aseret Tshuva, somebody called up, I'm not going to say what town they were traveling to, but they were driving down. One of the things the KVH has is they certify a whole bunch of Stop and Shop stores, in-store bakeries. The ones in this area are not certified by the KVH. Main reason why it was not b'shaita in its time was because the local rabbanim here did not want it to be certified, so the KVH said they're not going to do it. But of course, we know that the world of business doesn't work that way, so some other rabbis certified it. So this woman called up the office complaining that she was driving down the throughway, picked up a box of croissants, had a symbol on it, it's kosher. And then she went to the deli refrigerator and bought some Empire Meal Mart, I don't know, whatever brand of deli, and made herself and her husband a sandwich, and they ate a sandwich driving back home. And halfway through the sandwich, she said, this croissant tastes too good. And she looked at the box, and she said, it says dairy on it. What's going on? So she called up complaining, how do you certify a dairy croissant? We know that the halacha is you're not allowed to have dairy bread, you're not allowed to make dairy bread, so she's saying, croissant's bread. So the national hashgachas, the general way the kashrus world works is that croissants are not considered bread, they're considered a pastry. And pastry, most poskim say, is not considered part of that gzeira of pasach levis, of bread that's dairy, and therefore there's no problem. It said dairy on it, said dairy clearly. It was smaller, whatever the details were. But the point is, this person never even thought for a second that croissants would be dairy. Well, what kind of hava amina do you have on such a thing, right? Who would have thought? But yes, it's possible. It all depends on what you're used to. So the second you go out of your element, it's these are the questions. So the three questions that we put on that I put on the agenda to talk about a little bit: meat, cheese, and wine. Those are the usual questions that people think about. Meaning when people go to a restaurant in an out-of-town place that they're not familiar with, one of the first questions that they're going to ask people is, what's our shchita? What type of shchita are you using here? On that same vein, people will turn around and say, it's only a dairy restaurant, right? What's going to change that? What's going to be a problem? Well, let me tell you, there's usually more problems in dairy restaurants than there are in fleishig restaurants. Dairy restaurants are just as complex, if not more. So people have this misconceived notion that if it's a meat restaurant, then we need a mashgiach tmidi. We need somebody there full time because there's a halacha of bashar shenesalam and ayin. We don't really pass in bashar shenesalam and ayin like people use that terminology. Again, we're not talking about bashar shenesalam. I'm just saying it's not as black and white as that is. Well, but that's what people know to hype on. And then they say, it's a meat, we need a mashgiach tmidi. But a dairy place doesn't necessarily need. And it happens to be that dairy restaurants can have just as many problems, if not more. Whether it's b'shalakim problems, b'dikas telayim problems, checking infestation. Dairy restaurants tend to have a lot more veggies than fleishig restaurants. There's a lot more veggie checking to go on. So what do you do about that? So these are the three things that generally people will end up asking about. They'll ask about what wine is being used, does it meet my standards or not? What cheese is being used and what meat is being used. So we'll just talk a little bit about that to understand what those issues may be. Somebody mentioned to me recently about a certain location, North America. Again, I'm not going to use names exactly, but a certain something came up in the community about what shechita they were using. And there's a Chassidish Rav there in this town that's involved in the Ashgacha, and they said, no, we can't use that shechita. Some group said we can't use because the women don't cover their hair up to our standard. They cover their hair, just not. They don't wear tichel. They wear sheitel. They wear, all these, and he was just flabbergasted. Like you're coming up with new things that doesn't say anywhere. But yeah, there are some communities that they're makbid, that the shachtim, that they hold them up to a higher standard than the rabbanim that they would hire in the community. Chassidish shechita, what does that mean? So Chassidish shechita doesn't mean that much in essence, meaning that historically Chassidish shechita referred to a machlekes that existed 200 years ago about sakinim ulutashim, about a way of how the knives were sharpened from both sides. One side, What exactly that means, very few people to know today even know shachtim. It's so out of touch. But the Chassidish Shechita became a verbiage that was used in the United States. In Europe, almost nobody uses it. In Eretz Yisrael, it doesn't exist. For Shechita of people that were more Erlich. I don't know this for a fact, but I was told broyers, KAJ, they're makbid Chassidish Shechita. Why? Because there were problems with shachtim in the 40s and 50s, and Rabbi Breuer said that he wanted to copy the Satmarav Shechita because the Satmarav Shechita was done properly. So he just copied it, copy and paste, exactly what it was. So that's what it ended up being. But Chassidish Shechita, when people generally are talking about it, they're talking about 3 points. At least that's what I heard from my Rebbe, the Boston Rebbe's that they want. There shouldn't be any bachrim that are involved in shechita. Shachtim should be with people that are married and have a real achrayus. The beard should be a full beard, with not trimmed in any way, shape, or form. What that has to do with shechita, again, different point, but that's something that the Chassidim were very makbid about. And then one of the other things is that shachtim should go to mikveh every day before shechita, which. Again, what might it have to do? Maybe it doesn't. It is brought down in Hilchos Eretz Yisrael from Eldon Adani. How authoritative that is a different debate, but it is something that is mentioned, and it's something that the Chassidish community is makbid about, up to a point where I once was speaking to a duck farmer somewhere in Pennsylvania, and he said that he told me what brand. I'm not going to say what brand it was, but they did a duck production 15 years ago, and in order to do that duck production, the Hashgacha insisted that he install a mikveh on the farm, so the shachtim can go to the mikveh before shechita. Right? They did it once. It was a one-time investment that didn't pan out. One of the other things that comes up with meat, which is not so much negea to America, but it is negea to Eretz Yisrael. On this particular point, there are many different points, is how exactly you do the nicker. Is nicker done in Eretz Yisrael? They have something that's called nicker Yerushalmi, which is not the way Europeans or Americans do nicker. Some of you might be aware that nicker is an expertise, but it's also something that people generally associate only with the hindquarters of the animal. But it is something that's also done on the front corners. On the hind corners, there are deraisa nicker that needs to be done to take out chaylev and gidanasha. And Ashkenazim, for sure, even many Sfardim, generally don't do nicker at all. There's a debate if it was done properly, if Ashkenazim are allowed to eat it or not amongst the poskim. But it's not readily available with any normal hashgacha, for sure not in North America. But on the front, but that's in the hind quarter. On the front corner, there's also nicker that needs to be done because there's gidei dam, there's blood vessels, major arteries that need to be that the blood won't come out with malicha, with salting. So there were basically two different ways how to deal with that. The regular way that is done in the United States and is done in Europe was to take out those entire arteries in their entirety. In Israel, for whatever reason, the minhag was to only puncture those arteries. So they puncture the veins. In America, it'll be very hard to find a nice looking tongue for Rosh Hashanah or whenever you want to buy a tongue during the year. Why? Because when they take out the veins, there's 2 veins that go through, they butcher up the tongue. Doesn't look very good afterwards. In Israel, you'll find beautiful looking tongues, no problem, because they don't take out the veins, they just puncture. They stick a knife through in a few places, and you're good to go. So if somebody goes somewhere and they have meat of a different variety, and these are points that are important to them, then they might want to refrain from certain shchitas. So it is an important question to realize, to understand what is my standard, what are the things that I should be looking for as an individual Jew in Klal Yisrael when I'm looking at meat. Am I buying any meat on the market and I'm just saying, I accept hashgacha pleini almaini, I'm buying it no matter what, or no, I want to make sure certain things are done properly. There are hashgachas that stops slaughtering in South America because there was a very high issue with DA cows or other operations that were done on the cows that might render them a treifa. Other hashgachas, they continue slaughtering there. DA is a acronym for displaced aspasim. It's a Machla, it's a type of disease that cows get from a bloated spasm, and one of the ways that they solve that is by puncturing the stomach. It affects the dairy industry, but it affects the entire cattle industry. So there are ways how to detect it. Whether it's practical or not is another question. In the dairy industry in the United States, they don't, now that we're talking about milk, but we'll shift into cheese. In America, the hashgachas remove all such cows from the herds so that there's no concern in Chalav Yisrael milk in the United States, or at least there shouldn't be, for having milk that came from a displaced basim, which a cow that might have a shiloh of treifa. In Eretz Yisrael, they actually don't remove these cows. They do operations with a mashgiach present, and to make sure that it's not done in a way that renders the cow a treifa. Those are debate if that's good enough or not. Is it physically possible to see everything? Is it not physically possible? That's already a level of detail beyond what we'll be able to talk about tonight. So again, shifting from the meat, talking about the DA cows into cheese. So what is Chalav Yisrael? If you want cheese that you want it to be Chalav Yisrael as well, what exactly does that mean? Does it mean that there's a mashgiach in the vicinity? The Darkei Tshuva brings down that there were people. It's rejected lahalacha, obviously, and he brings down, forgot from whom, but there were people in Europe that they wanted to make cheese, or they needed milk for the community, so they put one mashgiach in the center of a village, and in that village there were, let's say, 10 different farmers that were milking their own cows. So there's a mashgiach sitting in the village. So maybe that's considered Yoshe B'tzad Edroi. It's sitting on the side of the herd, and you're able to see. Well, not really right now, but if I walk another 5 minutes, then I'll be able to see. Well, so maybe that's good enough, right? So that was rejected. It's not accepted norm. But there are people that they feel that's perfectly fine. So is that a type of Chalav Yisrael, a type of a cheese that you would want to eat? Okay, again, if your Rav says that's fine, I'm not going to argue one way or another. It's for sure not what is considered normative halacha and not normative kashrus in the 21st century. And again, like I said, the Darkei Tshuva already brings down that it's a rejected approach. So if you do have a mashgiach, we know that it is for chaliva, for milking, yotze v'nichnas is enough. What does that mean, yotze v'nichnas? Is a mashgiach coming once a month? Once a week? Once an hour? Once every 5 hours? What's that frequency? So it makes a big difference. So there are some mashgachas that will insist the mashgiach has to be there the entire time. Not necessarily because it's halachically mandated, because you have to, according to Shulchan Aruch, but because it starts getting to a debate of nitnu dvarach l'shiurim, of exactly how long. Is 10 minutes enough, 15 minutes enough? At what point does this become just not sustainable and not black and white Chalav Yisrael? So that's the first step of making cheese. The next step of making the cheese is obviously the cheese making process itself. Adding the rennet. There are some hashgachas that have, for various reasons over the years, the norm just to set the premise. Most hashgachas in the world, since as far as I know, everybody's been doing this. They have a mashgiach put the rennet and put the cultures inside the milk in order to make the cheese. It's what we call Maimed B'Yad Yisrael, to make the cheese by a Jew. The Shah says this is a requirement. If the milk and the cheese operation is not owned by a Jew, it's a requirement not just to see the cheese being made, but it's a requirement that the Jew should actually be involved in making the cheese process. It's not black and white la'alacha, but that is what was accepted by virtually everybody. There are some hashgachas that have moved away from doing that in specific scenarios. Why? Because it's not practical for whatever particular setup it is. Is that a type of cheese that you want or not? So again, if you're accepting hashgacha across the board, and you're saying, I accept hashgacha X, and then they have this thing that is something that is not a standard that you want. So how do you reconcile those two things together? So if you say, I follow the hashgacha no matter what, that's great. Then you don't have this problem. But if you have a standard that you want to follow, then that becomes a little bit more difficult. Most cheese making has something that's called brining process. They're not just adding salt to the curds, but they take the cheese and they soak it in brine. Brine is a davar charif. It's a sharp food. If the brine was treif, or if the brine was in a treif vat, in a vat that's not kosher, then the cheese that will be made in that brine will also be not kosher. So you can have kosher brine, kosher cheese that was made Gvinas Yisrael with Chalav Yisrael. Everything was done good up until that point. But then you put it into a brine tank that the brine was kosher up until a minute ago. But you put it into a treif brine tank, right? So now everything becomes treif. Everything can become a problem. So how are people dealing with this? So there's various different ways how hashgachas deal with this problem. Obviously, the best way is to have your own dedicated brine tank, and you avoid this problem. But it is something that comes up. We'll get there in a minute. What do you do with low temperature cheeses? So cheeses, when cheese is being set up, when you're setting the cheese, there's a temperature that you need to add the cultures, add the rennet that it needs to be set at. So generally, you're going to be heating up the milk to get to that temperature. So how do you look at that kli? Do you look at that kli as if it's cold because it didn't go past Yad Seledes, because it didn't get hot, that you would burn yourself or recoil from it? Or do you look at that as a kli, as a vessel that is below Yad Seledes? What's the difference? A big difference. If it's below Yad Seledes, if it's lower temperature, then technically the vessel never became treif. But if you're looking at it, well, it is on the fire, right? There is something that's heating it up. So, realistically speaking, at some point, there is a very high heat. So if you touch the vat while it's running, you actually might recoil. The milk itself might not get hot, but the kli might. So it's a complicated question. I'm not saying one way or another. Different kashrus agencies, different rabbanim have different ways of looking at this. But it's a point to be aware of, that it's not a simple matter of, did you make cheese? Did you have a mashgiach there? You had a mashgiach there? Everything's covered. No, there's level upon level upon level of minusha that goes into making sure that this cheese or this meat is being done at a level of kashrus that one might desire. Which brings us to wine. Wine is probably the most complicated thing kashrus-wise. Why? One would think that meat is. Meat is pretty much the only thing that we eat that's a real deraisa. Wine coming from Eretz Yisrael can get into deraisas maybe, but and for meat is the only thing that everywhere does. Meat, you have one split second that is very complicated, which is the ma'aser shechita itself. Afterwards, I'm not saying everything else is simple, but everything else you don't have to have done only by Shema Shabbos, Mashgichim, Yirei Shamayim, where if you do things off by 1 second, by 1 millimeter, you get into a black and white treifus question. If you put a little bit less salt, a little bit more salt, it's not going to be asked for the meat. In Eretz Yisrael, I think in America there's only one slaughterhouse I think that does this, but maybe there's more, but I think there's only one. But in Eretz Yisrael, most of the better ashgachas, they have the molicha by chickens being done only by Shemer Shabbos, Erlach and Galait that are doing the molicha. But there's no real requirement to do that, and one can debate even if it's better or worse. Again, not the topic, but it does have its downsides. When you deal with wine, anytime you move, things can go wrong. So when you're talking about different levels of ashgacha, and I've been by many wineries, both in Eretz Yisrael and in Chutz La'aretz, you go to some wineries and you see that the ashgacha has, to say perfect system, nothing's perfect, but as perfect as you can get. You literally can't move Dalet Amis without the mashgiach shadowing you. You just can't. The place is under lock and key, literally, right? Almost like Fort Knox, right? Lock and key. And you go to other places, and it's more lax, more relaxed. So, yeah, maybe I look like a frum guy, so they let me walk around maybe more. But you see sometimes places that they allow people that are not as, don't look so frum. So when you're dealing with wine, it's a lot more complicated because all you need is one split second that somebody touches it that's not authorized, and nobody knows anything. With meat, you have one time that such a thing can happen, the Bais HaShechit itself, and we don't entrust that to anybody but the shachtim. And but at the wine, you have multiple people that are roaming around, that are involved in the winemaking process. So it's a very, very big question. How is that being controlled? So yes, does every winery have a mashgiach there? They all have a mashgiach, multiple mashgichim. But how tight is that control? In Eretz Yisrael, there are two more things that come up that people just don't think about. They think about wine. They go on a tour to Eretz Yisrael. They visit a winery and everything looks great. But then they don't realize that you have two more problems. Trumas and Meisus, obviously, which is very complex, because if you have grapes coming in Eretz Yisrael, you can have grapes coming from 3 different regions, and one might be a Trumas and Meisus Vadai, one might be Trumas and Meisus Suffolk, and one might be Putter entirely. And you can't take Trumas and Meisus from the Suffolk or the Putter on the Vadai. So you have to keep very, very, very tight oversight and tracking on which grapes came where and where they're being stored and what the quantity is. And it's very easy to mess this up, because they take Trumas and Meisus usually only once, around Tu B'Shvat time, a little bit before that, and that's it. So if they didn't keep track from the time of the vintage until it gets to that stage, it's very easy to mess up Trumas and Meisus. Arla is another problem that in America doesn't exist, because the klal is the halacha Suffolk Arla b'chutz la'aretz is mutter. We don't even investigate it. We don't look into it in chutz la'aretz. In Eretz Yisrael, as Suffolk Arla is usher. So it's a big, big issue. And it's very hard to track that unless you're tracking it literally from the day the vines were planted, and making sure that they don't get rejected and that they're growing properly and nothing's withering away and then they're replanting. Chaisamais. How are things being sealed up and controlled in these wine operations? So it's a very, very detailed question. How is the control systems? You have mashgichim controlling everything, and everything's under lock and key. It is Fort Knox, but okay, things get sent from one place to another. They go in a tanker. How is that being controlled? There's a lot of different details in how that's being set up. And then, of course, again, as you saw, this almost doesn't exist, but I mentioned before, Matayar Yein Shel Nachri, if you're dealing with a winery that's not Jewish, which almost every winery outside of Eretz Yisrael is dealing with such a setup, they're all, even the ones that are fully Shem Shabbos owned, fully Jewish owned wine companies, they have some element of their business that's not being done in-house, it's being done outside, and they're sending wine out. So how do you deal with that? It's very, very complex to deal with setting up a format of Attired Yein Shel Nachri in a way that is 100% across the board acceptable. There are literally some opinions in halacha that will, according to one opinion, it will be fine. According to the other opinion, it will be not fine. In what this one's solution will be, the other one will reject. So to get all of opinions under the belt is very, very hard to get done. I think we need to wrap up a little bit. We're going to go to some Q&A points. So I hope we touched on some of these issues of meat, cheese, and wine in the general hashgacha aspect. I just want to finish off with one more point, and then we're going to go to questions. The Gemara in the beginning of Chulin, Mishnah says, Hakol shachtin v'shchita sheira, and the Gemara gives a few explanations for how to explain the Mishnah, because it's sort of contradictory. It says Hakol shachtin is b'diavad l'chatchila. It doesn't really make that much sense. The halacha that's derived out of that sugya in the beginning of the Gemara is that, again, this goes back to the shtetl. Today we're buying meat in a supermarket. We don't have a way of going and checking the sheichet's knife. But the halacha that's brought down in Shulchan Aruch and the Simul Chadasha is that you're supposed to check a sheichet's knife before he shechts your chicken. He shechted your chicken already, and you can't check it before, so you check it afterwards. Okay? You can't check it afterwards because he's gone. Then that's when we fall back on this default, this nebuch. We don't have a better choice, so we're falling back on this hakol shachtim, and we're relying. The Simul Chadasha says you can rely on Talmidei Chachamim Shebe'ir. You rely on the sages that are in the area, that they for sure would not allow a takala, a major issue of treifas being sold in the community, so that you can fall back and rely on that. The point I'm bringing this Gemara is because we should not fall into a trap of saying, there's a symbol, everything is good. Hashgachas make mistakes, mashgichim make mistakes, and if consumers are not vigilant and don't care, they don't ask questions, they walk into a place, they don't ask to see the kosher certificate. It expired 6 months ago, right? The hashgacha switched. The rabbi was nifter. These are things that happen all the time. Right? There's fine print on the certificate that if you would have read, you would have realized something doesn't make sense. There was recently a Maisa, right? There's some place in Monticello, some casino that they copied a certificate from somebody else and they just put it up on the restaurant wall, and there were people that went and ate there, right? So some people say, shunned on the place, and I'm saying shunned on the people that are eating there. You didn't read the certificate. You would have seen right away the thing looks like a forgery, right? So again, it doesn't patter the casino for putting it up. That's not the question. The question is, why are people not looking at what it says and caring about those details? And if people would do that, then we would have a much better matzav of kashrus. So we should remember that the ideal is not just v'shchitas and sheira b'di'eved. The ideal is hakol shachtim l'chatchila, that we should be checking before we do it and not after the fact relying on leniencies. Question?
Yeah. There's such a type of drink called protein drinks, which usually used to be made out of soy, or some of them which didn't have actually used to be made out of whey. Today we start finding kosher ones, even with chalav Yisrael, in protein drinks. What are the issues regarding chalav Yisrael and whey? And also, is there shalav evim and achai?
Yeah, so whey is a complicated topic. We're not going to be able to cover the full range of the topic, but let's just suffice to say that at least in the United States, the kashrus agencies have, for non-chalav Yisrael I'm talking about, have come to a consensus that everybody agreed upon to follow pretty much the chumrah of almost all the paiskim, meaning they took chumras on both sides, all three sides, and whey is not considered kosher unless it came from only kosher ingredients of cheese. Whey is the liquid that comes off of cheese making. So when you make cheese, you take a gallon, let's make it simple, 10 gallons of, 10 pounds of milk, and you make it into cheese. You're going to end up approximately, depending on the type of cheese, you'll end up with 1 pound of cheese and 9 pounds of whey. Okay, so when they're making a whey protein drink, they're taking that whey and they're drying it, and then they're adding that dried whey powder to the protein shake. So the consensus amongst Ashgacha for chalav stam, not for chalav Yisrael, is to only use whey that came off of kosher ingredient cheeses that were made below yad seledes. They were made at a lower temperature so that it should not absorb any flavor, any tam from the treif cheese. Okay, because the cheese, if it was not made kosher, if it's not gvinas Yisrael, the cheese is treif, right? But the whey can still be kosher. Again, for chalav stam, not chalav Yisrael, as long as it was made at a low temperature and with kosher rennet, kosher, all the ingredients have to be kosher, the kalim have to be kosher. And that is what pretty much the consensus is. The reason I'm saying it's complicated is because there's some poskim that say that whey is treif, it's considered part of memei chalav, that was never mutter in the heter of milk. What's being alluded to here is Eiver Min Achai. Who said milk is kosher is coming from a live animal. We know that the rule is that anything that comes out of a live animal is considered Eiver Min Achai. But there's an exception for milk because the Torah says Eretz Zavas Chalav Dvash. So milk is for sure something that the Torah is matir. The Torah said, what? So whey is a part of milk, but Meimei Chalav, the Gemara says, it's machloikas. Again, it's beyond the scope of now. But it's not simple. The general psak is that whey is kosher, and for chalav stam, it's relatively easy. In the United States, most whey is kosher. In Europe, that's not necessarily the case. The main issue that comes up with whey, like I said before, is the ingredients and how the whey itself is being made. But like I said, it's also a dried product. Where are they drying this whey? So in the United States, most, at least as far as I know, from what I've seen, most whey is being dried in dedicated dryers for the whey industry. They don't even dry milk in the same dryers, generally. In Europe, from what I've seen, that's not necessarily the case. They dry cheese, they'll dry anything else and its brother in the same dryers. But there's also a lot more treif cheese on the market, meaning cheese that's made with treif ingredients and treif kalim above yad seledes in Europe than there is in Eretz Yisrael. The other point to raise with whey is that there are some poskim that were more lenient. If there's anything that's, anything, butter is the most lenient thing. But I think Rav Ruderman in Baltimore from Ner Yisrael, he was matir whey, even for people that are makbid on chalav Yisrael. So there are shitas. It's something just to be aware of when you're rating what things are bigger issues and lower issues. Whey is a lower issue than any regular chalav akum product. So Eretz Yisrael has, on these type of things, Eretz Yisrael will always have an advantage. Because, I'm going to repeat the question. The question again was, is there an advantage to Israeli wines over Italian, American, French, Australian, New Zealand, whatever, kosher wines? What? Spanish, yes. Argentinian, Portuguese, and we need our port and our vermouth and our Burgundy and whatever. Yes, so Eretz Yisrael will always have an advantage on anything high risk like this, because at the end of the day, the majority of the country keeps kosher. The majority of the country, you can debate if they're really Mechalei Shabbos b'far Hesi or not. You can even debate that also, even though they're not all from. You can debate what that translates into reality. So therefore, the environment is much more friendly to Kashrus. There are wine companies here in America. I was recently in a winery here that they told me that their Rav Machsher, again I'm not going to use names, but their Rav Machsher was very, very happy when they asked him to certify the place, because there's only Jews on the premise. So there are people that are not from that work there, right? But the entire staff is a Jewish staff. So again, from a dynamic of making wine aser, right? Not yain nesach, but stam yainam. As long as you have a Yehudi involved, it's always going to end up halachically being less complicated than the second you have goyim. The Rambam said Muslims have a different din. We don't pass in that way. But again, you have to know what exactly you're dealing with. If you're dealing with China or India or places that are really Ovid Avodah Zarah, then it's a much, much bigger problem. Yes.
Okay. Dish soap, liquid powders, liquids or powders that wash dishes, do they require hechsher? Could you use detergent, regular detergent?
So as far as I know, the consensus of most of the Paiskim is that there's no real problem with it, me'ikar adin. Things that are used for personal hygiene, there is a chumrah of sichak shasiya, that anything that you slather on your body is a form of consumption, and therefore that has a bigger stringency. It's actually interesting to note, if anybody likes history in the United States, if anybody looks up any of the old pre-Pesach ads in Jewish newspapers or general newspapers from the 1800s, you'll find that they were selling kosher meat, matzah, wine, and soap. That was one of the things that they always made, because soap was made from lard, it was made from tarfus. So when it became Pesach, everybody was very frum, and everybody wanted the kosher version. But the consensus of the Paiskim is not to be makbid, up to the point where there are some Paiskim, some ashgachas, I'm not going to name which again, that they won't even bother looking if the ingredients actually are kosher or not. Meaning there are some ashgachas, I don't think this is right. I think it's also a problem with Chashem Mishpat beyond not a shayla of Yeridea, right? People assuming that the Ashgacha is doing something, that they simply, you want Ashgacha on soap? No problem. Here's my pay the fine, and here's the stamp of approval. Because what do you mean? It's mutter. Mitzad Allah, it's mutter. The consensus of most American national Hashgachas, at least, I say most because there might be an exception, is that any detergent, even if it's laundry detergent, has to be using kosher ingredients only. They might be makel on kalim. They might be more lenient on certain things on how that's being made. But the ingredients in that laundry detergent that has a kosher symbol on it in the United States are all coming from kosher sources. There are no animal byproducts in there. What? Or soap, the same thing. I'm saying the consensus here of the national hashgachas, at least, is that anything that's certified kosher has to have, even if mitzad halacha, it might be 100% mutter. If you're putting a kosher stamp of approval on it, the ingredients have to all come from a kosher source. What? That's a different point. That's a different question. Why? But if it's being certified, you have to make sure that it's being done with kosher ingredients. Okay.
Fresh fish that you want to buy in a non-Jewish fish market. There's issues with samanim, there's issues with kalim. What does a regular person have to know when he wants to buy fish anywhere besides a kosher fish market?
So first of all, if you live in Flatbush, that shouldn't be a question. You buy in the kosher fishmonger and you don't have to deal with that problem. when I moved to Boston, one of the Ingaman there in the Cradle came over to me and asked me if he can buy, again, the bread. We talked about the croissants before in Stop and Shop. He said if he can buy the bread there. So I told him, why in the world did you buy there? You have a bakery that's closed on Shabbos. Everything is done properly, Attired, Sacrilege, so to speak. Why would you go shopping? So he gave me this whole thing. His wife works until late, and he finishes Cradle at 8 o'clock at night. The only store open was Stop and Shop and Shah's. They're open until late. Oh, fine. Now we're talking about a different story. So if you have a reason why, no, talk to your Rav and find out if you should rely on bidiyeveds or lachatchilas, right? And not something that's lamahadrin. But me'ikar adin. Anytime you're buying fish, the first question is you have to have simanim. If there's no simanei dagim, if you can't identify the fish as kosher, which generally means you have to see skin on the fish. Rav Nissim Karelitz B'nai Brak is the most machmer, the chut hashani. He's the most machmer on this. He doesn't even rely on skin. He wants to see physical scales. He says that there's no makar lahalacha, that batei kaskasim, meaning the space that's left over, the indentation, that we all can tell that there was a scale there. There's no makar that that's a siman tara, and therefore, unless you actually saw scales on it, it's not kosher. That's the most machmer shita. There are more lenient shitas that if you can identify the fish, most common example would be salmon. Most people, I think, in this room would be able to identify a salmon without any question. Maybe you wouldn't be able to tell me if it's a sockeye salmon, a Pacific salmon, a chum salmon, or an Atlantic salmon, or Norwegian salmon, right? You wouldn't be able to tell me that, but you would be able to tell that it is salmon. Maybe you would get it confused with some types of trout. Maybe. Probably not. Maybe. So there are some people that will rely on that. There are hashgachas that rely on that as a siman. I wouldn't say that it's a consensus. It's not. It's debatable. But as long as you can identify the fish as kosher, then the fish, there's no problem to buy the fish. The next question is cutting it up. So anytime that you're in a non-kosher environment, and again, it's very easy for people to make a mistake and say, all the fish here are kosher. I have a relative that lives in some country in Europe, and he told me, the fishmonger over here, the Rav in the community allows everybody to buy fish there because all the fish there is kosher. I walked over there, and one of the types of fish that they had there was not kosher. But, I have no idea what the basis was for, no idea. But assuming that the fish is not always kosher, which is the general assumption, you make sure that the knife is clean. Ideally, you should bring your own knife to a fish shop. But if you can't bring your own knife, as long as you make sure that the knife was cleaned properly with soap and scrubbed with a stainless steel or brush or whatever it is, and there's no Newness, no fat left over, then there's no problem to use that knife for cutting fish. Ideally, the cutting board should be covered with fresh baking paper so that they're cutting on that and not cutting. Cleaning the cutting board is not really practical. They put down fresh butcher paper and they cut on that, and that's not a problem. If for some reason one of these things cannot be done, then you can still get the fish. You just have to do what's called kiluf or shifshuf and wash the fish off underwater and scrape away with the back of the knife or front of the knife and scrape away those areas. Or you can cut off a small sliver of fish from any side where the treif knife was used for cutting. But again, in an ideal setup, nobody should ever need to do this. You're traveling, you're going on vacation somewhere, there's nothing else available. Okay.
Vitamins, over-the-counter medications, formulas like cough drinks, all these things. Rabbi Belsky stood here many years ago, not many, and he said that cough syrup, you should better do what your grandmother did, take hot chicken soup, because most cough syrups had then, for sure, glycerin, which was not kosher. What's the matzah today? What's the story with vitamins at Mechlal? And what's the story with chewables, not vitamins, over-the-counter medications? So
the first question that comes up anytime you're talking about chewables and swallowables and pills and these type of things is this something that's usher? The rule in halacha is that anything that's treif, once it becomes einer roy lager, the Gemara calls it, isn't usher. So if you have, in theory, somebody told me actually this recently that haven't verified this. But I've been told that Rav Chaim Kanievsky, he can't go for the full day on either Tisha B'Av or Yom Kippur without some kind of a little bit of fluids. So he makes a very, very bitter tea, like 100 tea bags inside a pint of water, and you can't drink it. It's mamish not palatable, but it is liquids. So he says it's pagum. It's tam pagum. It's not a food item anymore. and he has less than a share of that. So he's doing sort of both things, drinking less than a share and drinking something that's pogum to make it so that it's, again, I haven't verified this, but this is what somebody told me recently. The point is that not everything that comes from a treif origin necessarily becomes treif. So again, like I said with the soap, nobody would certify such a thing. A kosher ashgacha would not certify or should not certify vitamins unless all the ingredients in that are kosher. That being said, there are rabbanim, there are poskim that have no problem with people taking vitamins, or again any type of pill over-the-counter medication that is not certified. Again, I said some do. There's different levels on what you consider to be within that level. Some people will only rely on things that you need for something that would fall under the category of chayla she'ein bei sakana. Nobody's talking about chayla she'ein bei sakana. Chayla she'ein bei sakana, even a small, maybe even a michush. You have a fever reducer, anything that's for a pain reliever. And then there are those that will go. That's on one side, but they won't allow vitamins, right? Which is viewed more as a preventative measure, not necessarily a real medication. And then there are bottom that will say, no, even vitamins you could. So it's a really halachic question that people need to address to their own private rav, how they should be looking at over-the-counter medications and vitamins as a general rule. Once you go past that general rule, then you have to look at the ingredients and see what's in it. Usually, all these things are usually, again, besides flavors and a few other ingredients, you can usually tell from the ingredients how big of a problem it is or isn't. The glycerin that you mentioned, glycerin up until, again, this is something that people, when I started off with, we're used to our comfort zone, what we're used to. So people still hype now on glycerin. Some of us still hype on oil. Right? I was just dealing with a rabbi and a certain ashgacha about oil somewhere, and he was like, but the oil, find me the treif oil. Find me the company that's making now lard, rendering fat, animal fat, in the same rendering machines that they're doing vegetable oil. I'm not saying that oil doesn't need ashgacha. There are other things that can come up with oil that would be problematic beyond rendering animal fat. But this issue that existed in the United States 50 years ago, there are some people that still think it's relevant today. The same question is not necessarily relevant. Glycerin used to be a massive issue. Today, again, to say what the percentage is, I don't know if I would say a percentage. I will say that I've almost never seen animal-based glycerin anywhere, right? It's kimat not around.
I was told that in Canada it's much more common than the United States.
Every country is different. Every country
and
is
Europe
different.
Also.
In Europe, I've not seen it in Europe.
No.
I've not seen it yet in Europe. I'm not saying that it can't exist, that it doesn't exist, and I've heard this from other people in Eretz Yisrael that go to many. I think the I don't know if I would call it a consensus, but I think that the vast majority of mashgichim claim that animal glycerin does not really make it into the food market. There is a claim that is going to be changing sometime in the near future because of biodiesel and whatever. You have to follow trends. These things can change from one day to the next. So it is something that's very important to know. But I'd say glycerin, I would not say that it is fine because the glycerin is vaday mutter. I'm just saying that the glycerin is not necessarily as big an issue as people thought it was, or as it was.
I'll tell you, because the OU, a few years ago, the Talmud company, the motoring company, had a problem in the United States. They brought him from Canada, and the OU said that you should be mevatel it 6 parts of water.
Right. I remember that. Yeah. So, but I think that they knew that particular company was buying from what's it called?
So we don't know.
Yeah, he's saying all these things are things that it's very, very hard to verify. There are some things in kashrus that people think that because Shulchan Aruch tells us kol mashadef levru mevarinen, you have to check everything as much as you're able to check into it. So they think everything's easy to verify. Most things are virtually impossible to verify. They're very, very, very hard for not just a consumer, but even a client that's buying the product. It's very, very hard. I'm not talking about consumer buying. I'm talking about a factory buying it. There are many things that are just very, very hard to be able to trace and get 100% clarity where it's coming from, unless there are some ashgachas for some things. I remember I asked a certain Rav Machsher once about the chocolate for Pesach, and he said if I did chocolate for Pesach, we would do it bean farm to bar, right? Literally, shmura mishas ktsira, right?
Potato chips, there are Hamish brands and there are not Hamish brands. What's the shilas there? What I understand is Bishul Yisrael, kashering of utensils, the spices, and the other things.
Yeah, so as far as I know, I'm not saying that there might be some exceptions, The Israeli ashgachas, I think, do kasher. The American ashgachas, from as far as I know, don't kasher when they're doing runs of kosher of Bishul Yisrael potato chips, because it's viewed as a chumrah. Most poskim me'ikar adin hold that potato chips don't require Bishul Yisrael. Those that do want it are doing it as a chumrah. They're doing it because it's why not? Let's be better than that. And as a result, they don't. Most hashgachas, at least as far as I know, and I'm saying most. I'm not aware of one that does.
Do they change the oils?
Good question. I know that some do. I can't tell you that all do, but I do know change the oil, right? So meaning, this is again one of the things. If there's any Sephardim here, this is very relevant, right? People Sephardim want bishul b's yosef, so they go to a restaurant and so if they're getting a steak, it's relatively easy. So you can put it on. But even if he's putting it on, how treif are you looking at that bishul ramah? So if it's a grill, it's very easy. You can just ask the guy to scrub down with the grill brush for a few seconds, and okay, there's no mamushes, fine. Right, but if you're asking for deep fried schnitzel, the stuff's frying in the same fat together with you have a real problem. So the question is that are they changing the oil? So the answer is that I know that some are. I can't tell you every single brand because I don't know every single brand. Again, like I said in Eretz Yisrael, when they're doing these things, they are kashering the kalim as well. There are Israeli brands that they make it in Europe in certain places. The other problem that does come up is seasonings, and again, usually the process for making potato chips is that they're frying the chips. The chips are hot at that stage. Up until that point, everything is a dedicated power of operation, right? Up until that point, the potatoes are cold. They go into the fryer. The fryer is hot. It leaves the fryer. Things are starting to cool down. It's a klisheni already at that point. At some point, it becomes a klishlishi or a ravi or a chamishi, right? It might still be hot, and the question that comes up is by the tumblers where they're adding seasoning. So when they're adding seasoning, most plants that are doing this can be doing treif, kosher, and parv, right? So if you're getting a plain potato chip that's just salted, usually, not always, but usually it's either going to be a dedicated line or it's going to be less complicated. The second you add in multiple different flavors, they're generally adding on some oil. That oil might also be hot to help get it thick, and things get a little bit more complicated. Are they kashering that equipment? Are they not? How are they checking that it's not yad soletis? I was once in a factory that a hashgacha that was involved in there originally told this factory that they don't have to kasher the tumbler because it was below yad soletis. Well, how is that established? Which I'm not saying is wrong, by the way it was established. I'm just saying, stating the facts. It was established because the mashgiach, when this came up the first time, went and put his hand on it and said, it's not yad soletis. Somebody came from the headquarters one day to check it out, and we're not going to check with our hand, we're going to use a laser thermometer. It was 2 degrees above whatever this agency said is yad soletis. Now it's a problem, so we're going to have to kasher, we're going to have to say that everything is dairy or treif or whatever it is. Again, which way is right and which way is wrong over 2 degrees? Did Chazal have a thermometer that went with the laser temperature up to 2 degrees? Again, different topic. But how are you evaluating that, and is that being done in a good format to make sure that you don't have any problems? So that is the issues with a Hamish potato chip versus a non-Hamish potato chip.
Are Pringles less problematic than regular potato chips?
Pringles seemingly, I've never been there, so I can't really tell you. I can tell you from looking at reports.
Well, I do know that Pringles are milchiks now, and they have
right. Everything, all of Pringles are switched to being milchiks besides the plain Pringles, because of the seasoning aspect. I don't know what the setup was before, but based on the OU's press release about it, it seems like that they just didn't want to have to deal with separating and cleaning between runs and whatever form of koshering was being done there. Pringles is a drop more complicated because of a different point, which is that it's not made from whole potatoes. It's made from reconstituted potato flakes. There are those that hold that those potato flakes require Bishul Yisrael. The OU does not require Bishul Yisrael for it. It's a lengthy, complicated halachic topic, which we're not going to get into today. So what? They don't serve the potatoes. The potatoes are. Right, dehydrated potatoes. The potatoes are, though. If I cook potatoes, and then I dehydrate them. So am I saying now that I look at the dehydrated potatoes, or do I look at the potatoes? You have many examples. What? Again. If I have a pot in my home and I'm cooking a potato, right? I can eat that potato whole as it is. Nice mashed potato, nice boiled potato with butter on it, right? Nice and seasoned, savory. It's geschmack, right? Great. So that potato might be a problem with Bishul Yisrael. We're not going to get into the issues of do potatoes require Bishul Yisrael or not. Different topic, right? But assuming that it does require Bishul Yisrael. So I have a potato that's usher because of Bishul Hakum. Now they went and dehydrated. It doesn't make it mutter now. So there are places that say that it might make it mutter. Again, it's a complicated topic. The Hamish Ashgachas, at least on paper, in theory, do require Bishul Yisrael for potato flakes like that. They will not use regular potato flakes that are not Bishul Yisrael. The OU does not require that.
Candies,
let's get
candies,
to this, and then we'll take regular.
candies, junk food, sugar substitutes that contain cream of tartar or tartaric acid. Why do some ashgachas refuse to use it, or maybe most Hamish ashgachas, and some allow it?
So cream of tartar, tartaric. There are all these tartaric things can come from one of two sources. The original source is from winemaking. It's the Shulchan Aruch calls Weinstein. If there's anybody named Weinstein in the room, that's where the name comes from, right? It's the sediment that was left over in wine barrels. It was scraped away and purified, and that's what the original cream of tartar was. There is synthetic cream of tartar, which has nothing to do. It's made chemically. Talk to a chemist and figure out exactly how it's done. I'm not going to get into that right now. So the synthetic cream of tartar can be kosher mahadran without any problems. It's very hard to be able to identify and know from the regular product, especially because the major ashgachas generally treat, most of them, not all of them, most of them treat it as what's called a group 1, something that they feel does not require ashgacha. So it's very hard to be able to trace and go back and be able to verify exactly what it is. So, and then you get back to the same issue like the glycerin and the oil and other things where people, cream of tartar is an issue, so it's an issue. But there is kosher mahadran cream of tartar. You could have such a thing. Again, mahadran at what standard? What wine did it come up from? And what not? I will say one other thing, which is just it's an ironic point because the source for cream of tartar that Shulchan Aruch says is mutter is talking, if I'm not mistaken, it's the Rosh in Avodah Zarah that brings down from Baal HaTosfos that it's mutter b'diavad when the guy made it and used it in bread making. It was not talking about taking cream of tartar from a guy and using it. Right? It's talking about taking a finished product that the guy added something into it that's not going to make it treif. So, just an interesting point to note what exactly we're talking about.
Which chocolate?
When you mention potatoes, there's also a shallow dabachara because some of the spices they use on the potatoes are very sharp.
Right, so the davar charev won't really affect the potatoes at that point because it's at a later stage and it's cold. So the only way a davar charev will become usher is either if it's soaking in it or if you have a knife or cooking. One of the three things. It's not cooking and there's not really negaya to that as far as I know. Yeah.
Which chocolate company is kosher lechatchila? I don't mean that the other ones are not. Don't kasher from milchiks to fleishiks, so from milchiks to parv, or don't have any issues.
So ironically, at least on a policy standpoint, the national hashgachas in America don't kasher with what's called with shar mashkim, at least on paper, officially on a regular basis. There's always exceptions. Everybody should always know that whatever rule a hashgacha tells you does not mean that it's always happening across the board without any exceptions. There will always be a exception sometime, right? But the general rule that the national hashgachas in the United States have is that they will not kasher with shar mashkim. They won't use oil to kasher a chocolate line. The problem with chocolate is that kashering a dairy chocolate line with water is virtually impossible because no chocolate factory with the right mind will allow water into the factory. Water and chocolate just don't go together very well. It would be down for days. So generally, meaning in an abstract, if that's the only point you're looking at, then a national hashgacha would be better than some Hamish hashgachas in America or in Europe or in Eretz Yisrael because they allow some of them, again, we're not getting into names, some Hamish hashgachas do allow kashering b'shar mashkim because of, the Ramah b'diavad and whatever the details are why they matter it, whereas the national hashgachas won't. It gets a lot more complicated though than that because you have many things that go on in the factory beyond just how do they kasher. So if you can ask me that question, the Eid HaChreidus, it seems like, is doing the best job on everybody on koshering, simply because they tear down. I've seen pictures from this. I've never been there myself, and I have friends that have served as mashgichim in productions for chocolate that they certify. If it's not a dedicated facility of theirs, which they have in Eretz Yisrael, whatever, but when they do runs in other countries, they are tearing down the equipment and they're doing a libun kal on all the equipment. It looks brand new. It takes multiple days to prepare for koshering.
Baking chocolate and chocolate chips are different than this chocolate, am I correct?
Yes and no.
Okay.
Yeah, yes and no. It doesn't really make a big difference because any baking chocolate and chocolate chips are usually made on a more dedicated line than chocolate bars. But the initial step can still have the same problems. So you could still end up with a base chocolate that was made on a dairy line that's a dark 99.9%. There's a certain I was looking at I'm setting up a company that I was involved with, and they actually were using a chocolate that is 99% chocolate, certified by a certain hashgacha as dairy or dairy equipment. I don't remember exactly what, but not parv. They have a very few items that are parv coming from the same factory, because of how again, I wasn't in the factory, so I can't tell you what the exact setup, but I don't think that as a rule that somebody can say that baking chocolate is easier than regular chocolate. If there is a specific type of baking chocolate that is parv consistently, then yeah, that is probably better than, it's a different category as opposed to chocolate bar, which is more likely to be commingled.
What's the story with flavored coffees and flavored teas? Do they need a hechsher?
Yes, 100% they need to have a hechsher. Any flavoring is going to be a more complex item. Doesn't mean that it's always going to be complicated, but anything with flavoring, it can be much more complicated and is not a simple item. Flavored coffees and teas won't affect anything else that's made usually in the same factory. So plain coffee won't require hashgacha, even if it's made in the same factory that is making flavored coffees. It's done at a later stage, different equipment. It's not going to affect that.
Cold cereals. We see that officially the Hemash hashgachas are makbar and Bishul Yisrael, Pas Yisrael maybe, and the other hashgachas are not so makbar on it. Does it really need a Bishul Yisrael, Pas Yisrael?
It's machlokes hapaiskim. So the best source for this is to use a rav that was on both sides of the equation, as they say, right? The Ramesh Sternbach, the Rav of the Eid HaChreidus, has a tshuva in Tshuvas Vanagas that where he says the minig chutzah was to be makel on this, but in Eretz Yisrael they weren't, and it's obviously if you're able to do it and it's something that's able to be done, it's admirable for sure.
Assuming
right?
that the simple ones are not a problem with Bishul Yisrael because it's not oil shulchan malachim, the pas.
Right.
What about Cheerios or Fiber One, which are more like?
So again, you get into the same question. You also get into the question of brachas. What bracha do you make? So there's some poskim in Eretz Yisrael that say you should be washing when you have a bowl of cereal, right? Because they say it's tayar lechem and you're kaveh suda, you're eating breakfast, right? But in the land of Mazenas bread, right? To quote a manufacturer in this country that he told me when he started his business, he was selling bread in Williamsburg, and it didn't say on his bread, it didn't say what bracha to make. So somebody asked him what bracha it is. He says, "What do you mean? It's a mitzi, it's bread." He says, "No. What do you mean? It's for sure mezainis if it doesn't say otherwise, right? So in the land of mezainis bread, it's a little hard to take that statement, but because we're not kaveh suda on anything, of course, but. So to take that within the same, I don't know. It's a very hard. It's something that's not. It's subjective to a certain degree. What is oilal shacham malachim and what is tayar lechem? There's no. I'm still looking for makar. If anybody has a makar that says what tayar lechem is, I would like to see what that is because I've not found one. I've not learned everything in the world. So but if somebody has a makar, I would be happy to see what that is.
We have a lot of different types of whiskeys. I mean, Rebelski stood here many times and said that the Sheitzait Klal Yisrael should drink mashke only with a hechsher. That means any type of whiskey, vodka, and so on. But Lamaisa, a lot of Yidden do drink other whiskeys, vodkas, bourbons, and I don't even know the names. There could be a problem in additives. It could be a problem that they put wines in them, and there could be a problem that sherry casks.
Yeah. So, Yehuda Va'ed L'Kral, I'll agree with Rabbi Belsky. Of course, it's time, and it's only a matter of time before that we cross that bridge, and the norm becomes that only certified alcoholic beverages are accepted from households. I would say before you get to whiskey, I would say beer is probably a much bigger problem that people don't realize. Some of you might remember 12 years ago approximately, there was a whole big scare because they discovered that Budweiser was making a beer with clam juice, not a beer, they were making a tomato beverage or something in the same factory with a beer that had clam juice in it. The clam was not bottled, so all the kalim became usser, and all the kashrus agencies said you can't buy Budweiser in the can form. You could buy the bottles, but not the cans because it was made in a different factory, whatever the details were. If anybody remembers this Maisa. But it's very, very common. The major beer companies in the United States are certified. Miller's, Budweiser,
Coors.
What?
Coors.
Sam Adams, whatever. The major brands are all certified. The second you're getting into smaller players, even if they're very large regional players, virtually every single one of them would fall under the category of a craft brewery. Craft brewery can be as extreme as this is true. This is not kid you not. There are breweries that are making pepperoni pizza beer. They're buying 12 pepperoni pizzas or whatever the number is. I saw one said 12, right? And they're dumping it in the brew mash, 12 pepperoni pizzas, dumping it in, and then letting that ferment with the beer or cook or whatever it is they're doing with it. And then they're filtering it out, of course. Well, we're filtering it out. And you're not eating the pepperoni pizza, right? I mean, that's how bad it can be, right? So I've been to many beer companies. I've spoken to many beer companies. The consensus of most kashrus agencies is that anytime you're dealing with a craft brewery, it's becheskas aser, not becheskas mutter, right? So if you're dealing with large beer companies, that's one thing. If you're dealing with, and in Europe, the same thing. I mean, if you're dealing with large beer companies, major brands in Europe that are not certified, the chazaka is that there's a cheskas kashrus to it. Anytime you're dealing with smaller beer companies, the chance of them having real tarfus, or even if it's not real tarfus, ingredients that are chayav in bishul Yisrael, or other issues that can come up in the ingredients, is very, very, very high. The kashrus agencies do not recommend buying any such beer unless somebody looks into it. And it doesn't necessarily mean that Hashgacha looked into it, right? But you have to look into it, do due diligence, and find out that this beer company is not playing around with things. If they play around with things, then the sky is the limit. Literally, the sky is the limit. So again, this is with beer. So now you get the Scotch. What is Scotch coming from? What is it coming from? Oh, it's coming from beer. Well, not exactly, but yes, it's coming from. It's the same thing, right? So if you're making a distilled item that's coming from something that could be problematic, logic would dictate that that product should be complicated itself without getting to sherry cask and without getting to wine additives or any other complicated additives. So again, you can start analyzing and saying which scotches, which whiskeys, Irish, Canadian, Japanese, Indian, from which countries, what things are more problematic or less problematic. Bottom line is that they're not. None of them are 1,000,000%. Right now, again, I'm not going to tell everybody they should go and just buy things with a hechsher. It's not available in that level necessarily. But it's for sure better to buy one with a hechsher. And if it's available, get that. There's no mitzvah to buy, some whiskey that might have some questions in it.
How about vodka?
How about vodka? So, vodka is. I
know that they mix.
How about vodka? So, I personally have never been to a company that does just vodka itself. So I can't speak from personal experience, but I do know people that have been to quite a few, and they all claim that every single vodka company is chashud on distilling grape, and chashud on distilling dairy-based things. So could it be a problem? Yes, it can be a problem. How common it is or not, that's where you get into the question. So the halacha, basic Shulchan Aruch is that unless you're getting, if it's deraisas, unless you're passing roiv, it's not going to be a problem. Again, b'diavad at least. If it's derabanans, you can be toila even that there's only one place that does it in a kosher way that it's still fine. All the others, but it for sure is not glut. So for people that want to say that they're mahadr b'kashrus and we're only buying glut kosher meat and we're only buying the best of the best hashgachas or whatever, it's a little funny that all of a sudden on this one thing we say no, this is fine. So what? Oh, flavored vodkas for sure need a hechsher. We're not talking about flavor. No, but the flavor is happening later. The flavors are happening later. Flavors are happening later. Yeah, they're happening later. Again, you can get into problems because it's a davacharif and it's kavush and that's the least of the problem. The main problem is that they're using the same distilleries, and again, sadly, there are many people that either they love drinking or they think that they understand something. There's many times. Again, I'm not a heavy drinker, and I don't claim to be the world's expert on whiskeys, but I have spoken quite a few times to people that will swear up and down that this particular type of alcoholic beverage from this particular country has no kashrus concerns, and every time I look into it, it turns around and it's like, no, just flat no.
Nuts, raw, roasted, dry roasted, glazed. What are the issues like infestations, oils, the dishes that they manufacture them on, dairy spices that they add maybe?
Right. So nuts, obviously raw nuts don't really have any problems beyond infestation. Infestation is a very complicated beast. It changes vastly from location to location, and it's also very complicated dynamic that is very hard for most Rabbanim to grapple with. Try to get a Rav to tell you exactly what miut hamatzah is, what is muchzik, and how you measure that. They'll usually hem and haw, because it's not a black and white. Right? So Rav Vosner actually had the easiest way of saying miut hamatzah, because he said it's not a number and it's not a quantity. It's a gut feeling. Anything that you find on some kind of regular basis. So yes, it is subjective at that point, but it's much easier to grasp with. It makes it much harder because it means virtually everything is miut hamatzah. Virtually everything does require checking for infestation on some level, according to the way Rav Vosner understood it. So the one thing to understand about nuts is that generally most infestation that you find in nuts is not asur midiraisa, generally, because it's infestation that happens after harvest, after it's detached from the trees. So therefore, it's not considered sheretz hasheretz ala aretz until it's perished, until it separates itself from the fruit or the nut or whatever it is. If there's a bug that's inside, it's not always going to be deraisa, not even always going to be derabanan asur. So that's one thing that's just important to understand, that we're dealing with infestation that happens at a later stage during storage, and not infestation that happened while it was growing. In Eretz Yisrael, they generally tell people that you should be checking at least a small quantity of every single thing, meaning they're chayshish. They suspect that or I wouldn't say suspect, they lean towards a side of caution that maybe it's miut hamatzah because it's hard to define, and they say therefore you should always check a few nuts and see that there's no infestation. Then you can continue eating everything regularly, unless it's something that you know that's heavily infested. Which in America I don't think that is the general norm. The general norm is that these things are not infested, and most Rabbanim in America, at least as far as I know, from across the spectrum, don't require any checking for dried nuts. With regard to infestation. With regards to the processing of it, so there's basically two processes for making for making nuts, for roasting them. One of them is called oil roasting. Literally, fill up a big pot with oil and you dunk the nuts in there until they roast that way and the moisture gets replaced. are taken out, and that's one way. The other way is the old traditional way, which is dry roasting. You put them in an oven, or you put them in a tumbler of some kind, and you dry roast it that way. Dry roasting generally does not have any kashrus concerns by itself, meaning the drying process itself doesn't usually have any problems. You could have problems either when they're adding some kind of flavor or applicator before the roasting. I don't think that that's very common, but it does exist. Or what is more common is that the nuts need to cool somewhere. So if they're taking those nuts from the dry roaster, they're putting them either on a production line, a conveyor belt if it's a large factory, or large netted sort of tables that help it cool. They're putting those same tables are used for oil roasted. The oil roasted could either be treif or it could be dairy. Could be parv. Could be one of the three. So you're dealing with something where the kalim could be milchi, they could be treif, and you could end up with a problem because of that. So again, you want to say how problematic. It's a klisheni. Is it a davar gush? Is it not a davar gush? You can get into all kinds of different questions that come up. And so as a general rule, oil roasted nuts are for sure a problem without hashgacha. Dry roasted nuts, most hashgachas, at least in America, as far as I know, do suggest that people should only be buying dry roasted nuts with hashgacha. They're readily available. So again, I don't know why anybody would want in the United States to buy without. There are places in the world where dry roasted nuts have no problem. Hazelnuts from Turkey, for example. I've been told by people that work in the Ada that the Ada treats it as something that does not require hashgacha. They have not found yet any single hazelnut facility does not reach their high standard of kashrus, meaning there's no concerns whatsoever, right? And they're dry roasted hazelnuts. There are some types of nuts which you get into a Bishul Yisrael question. Chestnuts, there are some places that say that it has a shaila. Chasam Sofer already talks about it. There are nuts that you get into shaila of Bishul Akum, if it's something that's not eaten raw, only in a cooked or roasted form. What? For us, it's the same thing. Once you're using heat to make it ready to be eaten, we consider that to be cooked. There is a heter of shlein mivirasal de'aur, which some use for explaining why kloyas is mutter, and then it wouldn't apply to that also. But that's not generally the way it's done. Yes.
Herring and other canned fish that come from very far countries, and I was told by a good friend of mine, the Rav, that there was a certain Rav here that was relying on a certain shliach that was out there somewhere in the Ukraine or Russia, which was visiting the plant only once in 2 months, and he finally alerted him that fish need mashgiach tamidi, so he stopped giving hashgacha. He had no idea what he was doing. But there are a lot of fish that come from there in cans and jars and.
Yeah, so there's a lot of, sadly, there are a lot of people that get involved in hashgacha because just because somebody's a Rav and they learn halacha doesn't necessarily mean that they know how to give hashgacha, because they're not always thinking about how the practicality plays into things. And yes, especially fish, we spoke about that before, about buying fish from a fish store. There are many people that they just don't get that fish needs to have chesamas or hashgacha. Herring is a very interesting question because herring is generally bought and consumed without the skin, and there's no real identifier. I've read a lot of things on it. Some are real tshuva, some of it are just mamarim that people have written. I can't say that I have a very clear picture about why everybody's being matter. I've heard things along the lines of they rely on the silvery film color of the fish, that's also siman muvak. There's all kinds of different svaras why people come up that the herring is mutter. One thing, again, which we do have to realize, which is that even tuna fish, you asked about cans, tuna fish, up until 50, 60 years ago, most people, even Hamish people, were eating regular tuna fish without hashgacha. Rabbi Kotler, again, I didn't see this, but they say Rabbi Kotler ate it also. And Rabbi Heinach Padva from Kadassia in London, also, I know people in London, they told me they remember 20 years ago, 10 years ago, well after America adopted only using Hamish tuna fish, they were using John West, I think is the brand that everybody in England was using. Tuna fish, a Goyish company that they knew that was only doing tuna fish, and there was no other shilas there besides hashgacha on the fish. So it's a debatable issue. I know Rebelsky was very much against it. I asked him once why, I had a long conversation once with him about it. Rebelsky was not of the opinion that to be makel on tuna fish. But it for sure was minig oilam. It's interesting to note also the Darkei Tshuva has in Simon Kufnun Hey, if I'm not mistaken, which talks about things being nenefim of it azar, whatever. But it talks about fish oil. People wanted to use fish oil for refuah. We talked about that before with nutritional stuff. What?
Yeah, I just want to throw in.
So he had the Darkei Tshuva brings down a very interesting point when we talk about Simone Dagim. He says that I've been told, again, this is hearsay he's writing. I've been told that there's fish oil that comes from a kosher fish. Because on the bottle they have a diagram of the fish and it has kaskasim on it. Ayin Sham and Darkei Tshuva and Simon Kufnun Hey. Right? So again, the concept that we have today of fish, tuna fish and canned fish having chesamais and mashgiach tmidi and at what level is a very long, complicated halachic debate. Who's right or wrong is a different question. There's what's niskabel, and most of the world has adopted to require hashgacha tmidus. Not everybody. The OU does not require it, for example, but most of the world of hashgacha does require mashgiach tmidi for fish productions. If second, there's skin coming off. Herring is the exception to that rule, and I don't think anybody has a very good explanation why. There are hashgachas. Rav Land down the Ada, as far as I know, do have a mashgiach tmidi in the herring productions in the Netherlands. Now, what that means, how one mashgiach can see all the fish that they're doing when you're talking about little fish. Again, so here you get into a question: what does it mean when you talk about mashgiach tmidi for fish? Not everybody believes that you have to have a mashgiach that sees every single fish. There is a concept that some people have of re'iyas kol dag v'dag. I mentioned Rabbi Zalmen Krems before. The Mechas Chinuch, I think, it brings down such an approach that there's a chiyuv to do that. Not everybody agrees with that. There are many poskim that say it's enough to have a mashgiach tmidi in your yetzer v'nechnas. It's no worse than anything else. So as long as you're able to see every single fish, not physically, but technically you can see every single fish, then you're good to go. So if you have a mashgiach in the building, then they can process as many herring as they want, and you're good. So I don't know exactly what the Ada does in Orlando on how they control that, but they do have a mashgiach tmidi there.
Lipsticks, chapsticks. I know Adwi works very hard to make a kosher product, and he's bettering his product lately. And the Square Bezin, Chaim Avakshal gave me a list of other ones from a different company that are good.
So again, it's the same question that we had before about nutraceutical things. It's not food.
No, but here it touches
you're not
food.
eating. So the difference with that is the same reason why for Pesach many people are not makbid on other forms of cosmetics for Pesach, but for lipstick they do want to make sure that it's kosher Pesach because it does go in your mouth and it does touch your food and it does go at some point go into your body. So yeah, there is more reason why to be machmer, but at the end of the day, it's not food. It's not derech achila. There's no kavana to eat it. And ikar din, again, as far as I understand, most of the poskim say that it's mutter. How far you take, does that mean you should, if you have it available, you shouldn't buy it? No, I don't think that's what it means. Rav Vosner has a famous tshuva. Rav Vosner's talking about toothpaste, right? There's a ma'aseh they say about Rabbi Yasher Ber Soloveitchik from Boston, YU, that he said once in a shir, he said, he used toothpaste as an example. So somebody came to him a few days later and said, Rabbi, I gave my dog toothpaste to eat and he ate it. So he says, you have a kelav shaita, right? Right? But, so, toothpaste, Rav Vosner says that, again, I'm using this just to preface, Rav Vosner says even for toothpaste, we should be mahader and make sure that every single thing making the toothpaste is done properly with kosher ingredients on kosher equipment and done without any shortcuts, right? Because the way we set up Klal Yisrael, it's a line Rav Vosner has quite a few tshuvas that relate to kashrus. He ends most of these tshuvas with a line that says that we don't build Klal Yisrael on the basis of a terim of nepach, the bittel, the davasheshlam, we don't rely on these things.
I do want to mention that Chaskel Orbach just worked very hard to make a cod liver oil, L'Shem Shemaim. He works at MPGS in Lakewood, and they opened up a pharmacy. And we're very good friends. We make a lot of shirim together. So I called him up because people always call me about cod liver oil. So he told me he went special down to a company, and they're working on making something with lechatchila. It's good to know.
Gewaldig. Yeah, there is oil. I don't know about cod liver. I think this. Yeah, there is. Maybe there's not cod liver, but there is fish oil that is certified. Yes.
I went to a health food store and I heard somebody ask for kosher CBD oil.
Yeah.
Why does it have to be kosher? So it's only made from the hemp.
Right.
Yes,
So again, like anything else that's kosher, people want everything that's done
Repeat the
kosher. So
question.
maybe they're doing it on treif equipment, or I don't know. It could be there's a problem. It could be there's a problem. I'm not aware of it.
There's so many candies and chewing gums that come from different places in the world, and we see that the good, strong Hamish Hechsher do not give on so many candies, and we see that a lot of young or not big rabbanim or whatever it is always put their names or stickers on it. What does that show?
I don't know what it shows, but I'm not going to talk about rabbis or about hashgachas, but we could talk about products. Candies are a very complicated thing to do properly. There are companies that I know of that do things, for example, under the Ada, that they have pretty much invested millions of dollars for dedicated equipment just for them. They're not using it for other things, right? The candy industry, there's generally gelatin, there's generally carmine, there's generally other highly sensitive kashrus ingredients there, not to speak about milchigs and parv and so on and so forth. And it definitely needs a very, very good hashgacha. The question is, what the details are. You could have, sometimes it's more complicated. There are things that once upon a time the Eidach Vedas didn't have simply because they didn't have the supply chain for everything else. Other times there are things that, I know things that the Eida doesn't have, that there's no reason that they don't have it. It's simply nobody requested it. So it's all a matter of knowing the details of that particular thing. So if you have a specific product, we talk about a specific product. But as a rule, candies and confectionery products are very complicated. Kashrus-wise, it's not simple. There's a lot of the issues that can come up, and somebody that looks at it in a superficial way walks in and thinks, "Oh, everything's fine." I was in a candy factory in Europe where a certain person is doing productions there under a certain hashgacha, and I have no clue what they were doing there. I was asked to go review it to upgrade, so to speak, to a better hashgacha, and I was told beforehand this facility is a dedicated power facility. There's no milchigs there, and of course a foreign language. It's not English. And the person that was taking me around wasn't really production manager, but he knew the plant quite well. And we get the piece of equipment. I said, "What is this for?" He had no clue. And then I read what it says, and it says in that language, it says butter. And I'm like, I thought there's no dairy in this facility. Oops. Yeah, okay. They never koshered this equipment before for these kosher parv candies that they were making on this production line, right? So again, how not parv and how treif and how whatever, again, that's already a detail, but it's for sure not glat, it's not mahadrin. And on this symbol it says kashal mahadrin and a mahadrin, right? So that it's not.
We'll try to finish with this question. There are so many vegetables that companies that really require good bedikas tailorim. And there are so many companies in so many different places in the world that send a different type of mashgichim, a different type of levels of hashgacha. And so many of them are found to be problematic. What's the approach of the tzibur to such a thing?
I was in Evergreen in Muncie a few years ago, I think when I was still living here in the country, and I overheard a few women that were talking. There was by the vegetable aisle, the bodek, the kosher garden, the whatever, and one of them turns and says to her friend and says, "I don't know about all this stuff. I wash and check it like my mother checked it." Now, I'm not saying that she checked it very good. That's not my point. But the attitude is a good attitude. Meaning, just because it has a symbol on it, and just because it has ashgacha on it, and because it has a whatever, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's being done in the best way. The ideal way to a certain degree would be for each of us to buy our own chickens and take it to the sheikha down the block and get it geschachten in front of you, and you check the knife beforehand, like we said, right? And then you take it home and you do malicha, right? Are there some things that you might not be able to do as mahud, or maybe as the large factories? That might be. That might be that some minutiae detail you're not going to be able to get in every little sieve cut in Shah somewhere. But in general, you're making sure that it's being done 100% properly, right? If there's a shaila, you go ask your Rav and you get a psak and you get weiter. Anytime you're doing something on such a large production scale, it's virtually impossible for it to be foolproof. You don't see this in America, but in Eretz Yisrael, they have quite a few products that are labeled as not bug-free, meaning, just this is important note to know for the market. Some of this product does end up in America, but for sure, if anybody visits Eretz Yisrael, if you buy what they call gush katif lettuce in Eretz Yisrael, or parsley, or cilantro, any one of these things, it is not bug-free. It is 100% muchzik b'teloim. If you eat it without washing it, based on the washing instructions that they outline, you are definitely going to be eating a bug. Definitely, no, not a suffix, vadai, right? Why do they allow it? Because they basically came to this conclusion that making it perfectly bug-free was too hard. So what they did instead is they elected to go on a route of making sure that they only allow a certain amount of bugs that will get washed off when you wash it with normal washing conditions, right? Soak it in soap and wash for a few minutes, and then it will for sure come off. Every ashgacha has a slightly different interpretation for that, but you're talking about 3, 4, 5, 6, 8, 9 thrips, right? No aphids, because aphids don't always come off in washing. There's certain bugs that if they find one of them, the entire field will go straight to the garbage. Will go for non-mahadran produce. Some of that product comes here to this country, right? Usually it's cilantro, parsley, whatever, that they sell in these nice little plastic containers. And if you look in the fine print, it says that you have to wash it and soak it and whatever. But we Americans, we don't know from this stuff. What do you mean? The zek ziglich of them, right? The 6 seals. How much more kosher can you get than that? Yeah, but it has bugs. You have to wash it. But we just don't know. So anytime you're dealing with a product like that, it's just too hard to get it done perfectly, and you're always going to have problems. The question is how much problems. The question is how well a job they're doing on it. And so yes, in an ideal world, either don't buy it or do it yourself. That's the ideal scenario. But like I said before, from Breadless to the debate, anytime you're dealing with such a thing, it's never going to be perfect. It's not going to be mahadrim and mahadrim. It might not be required. Different point, right? But don't to expect that it's going to be always 100% free is not the case. Any other questions? After. Okay. Thank you very much, everyone.
Shame your term as Boston. I'd like to give a bigger shakayach to Rabbi Krems for answering all the Shabbos, to Tamadas, and to Ritzak Bold for asking the questions. To Tamadas. So I'd like to give a bigger shakayach to Blazer Steinmetz, a wise paints to sponsor tonight's shir, and it's also learned Lili Nishmas, Michal Yitzchak, Ben Yaakov Yosef, Sauer of Zechon Levracha. V'chanani ben HaKash Shemar, Tzakadosh Baruch Hu, L'zakis, Yisrael, Figir, Mitzvah, Mitzvah, Shema, Adonai Chofetz, and Tzidka, Yaglu, Teriyadeh.